Glad to know, Al. That Al is staring right at me too. I don't know about this. But anyway, Mary Garrett is our president. Mary, would you just raise your hand? Better known as El Presidente. But I do want to welcome you today. We have a wonderful program planned for you this afternoon. We certainly know that you'll gain a lot of insight into estuaries, a lot of great information. And, you know, estuaries, they are often called nurseries of the sea because of how important they are to so many wildlife species for food, habitat, migration, breeding. And our speaker today is going to give you a lot more information about estuaries. But before we get into that, and before I introduce Mr. Graybill, I want to go over a couple of housekeeping things. If you aren't familiar with the library here, restrooms are out those doors to my left and then just down on the right. We do have some light refreshments over here, which Mike happens to be guarding at the moment, and we're glad. We have brochures in the back, tells you a little bit about SEA, about volunteering or just membership. We are a 501c3, so we rely on donations to help us with our 34-year mission. Not only that, but let's see what else we've got. Some bird brochures, a lot of other things back there. And if you haven't signed in, please sign in. It really helps us when we go for grants and things to show that we actually are out there doing something and educating people. So if you could please do that, we'd appreciate it. So without further ado, Mike Graybill has spent his life as an advocate for marine environments, but he's also a wonderful expert in marine science. He's been an educator and a professional conservationist. Let me tell you a little bit about Mike's background. As a biology undergrad, Mike drove all the way from Pennsylvania, and I know how long that is because I drove here from Southern Ohio. He drove here in 1975 to the Oregon Institute of Marine Biology to study seabirds and marine mammals. In 1976, he received his bachelor's in biology from Coos, I hope I pronounced that correctly, State University in Pennsylvania. And then in 1981, he received his master's from University of Oregon. Mike spent the better part of his career, and many of you who have lived here for a while may know this. He was the manager at the South Slough National Estuary. Hope I pronounced that right. Didn't come out real well. But Estuary Research Reserve for many 28 years, was it? For 28 years. But again, as I stated earlier, he has spent his life involved in research and marine science. We're very fortunate to have him with us here today. And so I'd like for all of you to please make welcome Mike Graybill.
Well, thank you, everybody. I have to just do my little thing here. Greatly appreciate your taking some time out today, especially since it's the first calm weather, dry day we've had in a good long while. I grabbed a sandwich in Bandon before I came up here at the chocolate shop. They have great sandwiches there. And I go up to the headlands and look out across to check on the seabird colonies. And it was so glassy calm, all the little boats were actually coming and going out of the Coquille River estuary, which is, as many of you from this community know, is a fairly rare occurrence. I'd also like to acknowledge the folks that are joining us on a Zoom call today, a number of whom are people familiar to me. So I'll give a shout out to my friends that are out there in the virtual world and my family members that are there. I was chatting with the folks who were helping me get set up here today, and I realized that I have been presenting to the Shoreline Education Awareness Group from its first year of existence. And I'm told that it's a 34-year-old organization now. And I recall giving presentations prior to that, before I even needed glasses, to a group that preceded the Shoreline Education for Awareness, which was known as the Bandon Storm Watchers. Has anybody been to see the been around for abandoned storm watchers when it was here in Coos Bay. I remember chiding the audience members because it was a 35mm slideshow, right? So you dimmed the lights, you had the screen set up, the projector was in the middle of the room. And I remember when the lights went out, all I could see is the reflection of the screen in everyone's glasses. And I sort of chided them and said, man, look at all the bifocals in this crowd. So now I'm happy to join the bifocal generation. One thing that's of note is, even though I've given a dozen plus presentations to Shoreline Education for Awareness, the subject matter has always been about some aspect of nature. It's been focal topics on whales or seals and sea lions or shorebirds or seabirds. But it's quite interesting that I've spent my entire career studying and learning about estuaries, but this is the first time I've ever had occasion to give a presentation about estuaries to this group. So I have most recently given a presentation to this group that I was really grateful for the opportunity to dive a little bit deeper into a topic, and that was a presentation I gave about the developments that are in our community related to offshore wind. And I realize that some of you in this audience are volunteers that will be doing docent work out at the coast, interacting with people, interpreting the natural world for them, the seals, the sea lions, the whale migration, the seabirds that are in our area. But it's come to light to me to realize that you, as the volunteers of Shoreline Education for Awareness, are a brilliant interface of a knowledgeable, friendly person who's interacting with people who are also choosing to learn something about the coast. Well, there's a number of issues that are in play that affect our coast. While on one hand, it's very good to know about the seabirds and the whales and the seals that are there, it's also, I believe, very important for the volunteers that are interacting with the public to also be appraised of issues that relate to the care for the ocean and the care for our coast. So my last presentation about offshore wind was to elevate the conversation about what our relationship is with the ocean. And in that case, that was our relationship with the ocean as it relates to tapping into its potential value as a source of energy. Today's presentation is about estuaries, but I'm going to continue with that theme of how do we value and how do we interact with the natural world, except I'm going to move it closer to the coast today and see how that goes. So even though I've been working on studying estuaries for my entire professional career, it's a topic that I'm very comfortable with. I am really nervous. So please bear with me. This is supposed to be an interactive presentation. I'm nervous for a couple of reasons, because there's all these wires and technology hanging out in front of me, and I sure hope they work. It's the first hybrid presentation I've ever given. So here we are coming out of the pandemic. When you're doing Zoom only, then it's one thing and you can figure out how to operate in a Zoom only world. When you're giving an in-person presentation, that's something I'm quite comfortable with, but now I get to try and split the difference. So again, apologies to my friends and family who are watching this on Zoom. So here we go. My presentation today is about estuaries. And the most fundamental aspect of estuaries are these rich, important places that form where rivers meet the sea. So we get the fresh water from the rivers moving down toward the coast and interacting with the salt water from the ocean. Today, I worked with Dave Bone, who I have worked with for Shoreline Educational Awareness for many, many years, to try and set up a presentation that would, one, both satisfy as a training for those docents who are standing at the Bandon Marsh National Wildlife, for example, greeting visitors there and doing interpretation. So I hope to provide some content about these habitats and these environments. But I'd also like to, again, use this as an opportunity to engage your thinking process about how we value and how we care for these places. So I'll try and get to the content of the subject, the functions and values of estuaries, how they work, but also how we value how they work. And that really gets us to how we manage estuaries. And I can give you a chronicle of how estuaries in our region have been managed through time. But most importantly, I want to take some time to, again, inform you that there's an active decision-making process in play right now relating to how we value and manage Oregon's estuaries. And I would like to get you all up to speed and appraised of how Oregon goes about managing estuaries and what role you might play and the people you interact with might play in contributing to the structure of how we manage estuaries.
Mike, I'm sorry.
Yes,
I'm
yes.
sorry to interrupt, but we on Zoom cannot see the screen. Is there any way to get the owl to move? Or can you share your screen for us?
Let me just make sure I've done that. Is that helping you?
Not
Is
for
that
me.
working? Is that working for you?
I can see a fourth of the screen.
Oh, well, that's because you're looking at OWL. Can you share on your Zoom control? Because I'm sharing on Zoom right now.
Are you just sharing them? Do you have like presenter notes or anything?
Well, I'm trying to get back to here.
So I assume you hit share screen.
How's that look? And I don't want presenter notes. If you want me to do full screen, you can do that.
If you just share your screen. It seems like you tried that. And what do you see now, Arlene?
I see the PowerPoint estuaries.
Yes.
Do you see it in full screen or do you see like
No.
it in PowerPoint?
In PowerPoint.
Well, it's progress.
Yeah. Go from the beginning.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Double click.
I feel like it could have gotten big by now. Let's see what happens if we share screen too. Okay, and what about in this?
Yes, got it.
You see it full screen, so we're sharing that screen.
Okay, so how do I get to that?
Let's see now.
Okay, so now if I go down, is that, oh, that hasn't changed anything there.
What happened? See if this PowerPoint has two windows open. Now go to click on that. No, that's in try the other one.
Three of them going.
Now see if you go to the next slide. There we go. All right. How about now, Arlene? Did you see the slide change?
Yes, perfect.
Yes, that's
Okay.
perfect.
Business.
How about that for a confidence build? Okay, don't worry, this is being recorded, so if you missed that part, you'll get to see it again. So where was I? Okay, so trying to explain to you how, and to the people online, how Oregon goes about managing its estuaries, or at least how it's going about managing its estuaries today. But through the course of this, my professional career has been invested in the Coos estuary and in estuaries in Southern Oregon. I'm familiar with estuaries throughout the state, and I'll provide case studies for you about Oregon's estuaries in general, the Coquille estuary, the Tillamook estuary. But many of the examples that I offer will be from my case study, which is in the Coos estuary. And so I'll draw on what I've had as experience through my career. So are we ready to dive in now to estuaries? All right. Well, there's a couple of key messages that if you're interacting with folks on the coast, the most important key message is that sea level shapes shorelines. There's quite a bit of discussion about sea level rise that we're talking about in this climate arena. But I just wanted to give you a little bit deeper context for how sea level has affected shorelines. And the first point is that these shorelines are really a very important part of the estuaries because that's where rivers meet the sea and the rivers and the oceans interact with that. The rivers slow down and drop sediments. The ocean waves push sediments from the ocean into the mouth of the river. So the estuaries that we see today and live along the shoreline have had generally their shape the last 8,000 or so years. So if you look at this graph, you can see the blue part that's going up, rising very, very steeply. You can actually see that 16,000 years ago, the estuary, the sea level elevation was 400 feet lower than it is today. So that's because it was the ice age and much of the fresh water on the planet was locked up in ice, sitting on continents. And it was also because the oceans were much colder. So it's only been from the last 16,000 years to about 8 or 10,000 years ago that there was this 400-foot rise in sea level. So the estuaries that are older than 8,000 years have been submerged in the ocean from this invasion of the ocean through time. So when we look at an estuary anywhere around in our region or on our continent, you can reflect on the fact that they're about 8,000 years old at the most. And they take several general forms because the ocean interacts with the land since these are at the shoreline. And I've listed 5 major types of estuaries that are found throughout the world. And I'll walk you through some of those. A common form, if the sea level rises 400 feet at the mouth of the river, the ocean drowns the mouth of the river. And an example of that would be Chesapeake Bay or Delaware Bay. And that's just the small map that's shown on the right of the top left one. And that's really where the shape and the form of the estuary are dominated by this invasion of the ocean into the landscape and the river channel. If we go down and to the bottom left at the bar-built estuary, ocean processes then start to play a role in shaping the estuary, where you get sandbars and spits, creating these barrier island environments that create these protected inland waterways where this transition of fresh water to seawater takes place. And examples of that would be the estuaries in South Carolina and Georgia that have these fantastic barrier islands. In more northerly environments in Scandinavia, in British Columbia, the rivers were influenced by the river valleys were influenced by the scouring of glaciers. And so those end up being very, very deep, very steep-sided, and then the ocean invades subsequent to that seawater melt. So the shape of those estuaries are very clearly defined by the history of that river valley and watershed being dominated by glacial activity. Earthquakes and faults can also define the shape of an estuary, and San Francisco Bay is perhaps a globally significant example of what's called a tectonic estuary. We have the San Andreas Fault running right through the center of the estuary, and the water of the rising sea has just invaded that portion of the San Andreas Fault. So that's 4, which is all I could get on one slide. And the 5th type of estuary that you might have heard about is a delta type estuary. And the Mississippi River Delta is a fantastic example of that. And that's where sediment and erosion from the upland portion that are carried by the rivers come down and meet the slow, calm waters of the estuary and deposit themselves out in a fan-like delta. So those are the 4, 5 major types of estuary around the world. Most of the estuaries we have in our region are drowned river mouth type estuaries or bar-built estuaries. Another unique feature of estuaries is that they all have a gradient of salinity. We know the ocean is salty. It has dissolved salts in it, perhaps after the fashion of around 30 parts per thousand is what seawater is. It depends on where you are on the planet, how salty it is. But you can figure that 30 parts per thousand is about that. That's about a handful of salt in a quart of water. Okay? Rivers have salts in them, but they're hardly detectable, and they don't compare in any measure to the amount of salt that's in the ocean. So if we're talking about the transition from the river to the sea, we have to consider the fact that the fresh water is going to meet and mix with the salt water from the ocean. And there's a number of ways that that happens, depending on the size of a river, the nature of the tides, that sort of thing. So I've shown a cross section through the length of an estuary. So if you draw a line up through the middle of the estuary and cut it with a knife and look at it on the edge view, these would be ways that you could see this transition from the rivers in the light blue on the left-hand side of this to the ocean. The salty water would be on the salty water would be on the right-hand side of this screen, and it would be progressively fresher as you move to the left side on toward the river. Well, water that has different salinities has also different densities. So it's an interesting experiment just to say, if you took a quart jar of warm water and you put a cup of salt in it, very carefully, would it overflow? If the salt dissolves and you don't dump it all in at once, the salt will dissolve in the water and it won't change the volume, it will change the density. So the jar will weigh more. 1 quart of salt water weighs more, has more mass, because it is more dense than 1 quart bottle of fresh water that doesn't have a cup of salt in it. So when you have different densities, things don't mix quite so well. And this describes the nature in which saltwater masses and freshwater masses can meet and mix. So in some situations, you can have pure fresh water floating on the surface of the more dense marine water. So if you very carefully introduce that fresh water, it won't mix. It will simply float. And I encourage you in this rainy weather to look at the ocean. If we have a calm day with rainy weather, you can actually see rainfall puddles on the surface of the ocean. And that's because that fresh water has been introduced very carefully. It's floating on the surface and it hasn't had occasion to be mixed into the seawater. So that's how you can get what we call a highly stratified estuary. But you can also get a situation where the transition is fully mixed, where it just gradually moves. The further down the estuary you get, the saltier it gets. But if the tide starts to come in, that dense salt water starts creeping down along the bottom because it's more dense and it's colder. And you can start to get this thing where it's this partially mixed, or this thing that's called a salt wedge. So if you actually started here and measured salinity at the surface, it would be less salty than it would be at the bottom. All that goes on in estuaries. Down in Mexico and places where it doesn't get a lot of rainfall and not a lot of freshwater input, you can get evaporation at the head end of the estuary where the water is actually saltier because the fresh water is evaporating off. And that makes a lot of difference if you're a clam or if you're a living organism. Yes, sir.
Would that explain why when I was younger, we used to fish on the Chesapeake Bay? We'd go out about 4 miles and we'd catch rainbow trout.
Yes, it would,
In the
sir.
middle of the saltwater bay.
Right, because that's the Susquehanna River is the feed water for that, and that fresh water will float out over top of the higher density water. So you got salinity gradients, you got river sort of geomorphology. This is the Oregon coast laid sideways. And so we have the Columbia River on the right-hand side of the screen, and we have the California border, the Chaco and Winchuck rivers down on the left side of the screen. That's pretty much just to say there's about every time a river meets the sea, you end up with an estuary. So we've got 22 major freshwater sources dribbling into the ocean along our coast. And it turns out there's an estuary at the mouth of each and every one. In fact, there's even a bunch more smaller ones, like 10 Mile Creek. How many people been to 10 Mile Creek or New River? Each one of those systems has an estuary where the freshwater is transitioning. So if we start to zoom in now just for estuaries in our region, I mentioned that most of our estuaries are drowned river mouth type estuaries. And so that transition creates this range of environments that go from the ocean shore on up. And I thought what I would do is familiarize you with the major kind of life zones within an individual estuary. Are we good? So I listed 5 or 6 types of, see if I can go back. I listed 6 types of life zones that are found in the estuaries in our area. And I'll just walk you through examples of those. And we'll draw heavily on the Coos estuary for my examples. But you can find these examples in other estuaries as well. Some areas of the estuary, even though all areas of the estuary are influenced by the tide, some portions of the estuary never fully drain, even at low tide. And those are the open water subtidal channels. They're below the influence of the tide. So the bottom's never exposed. They tend to be the deepest places in the estuary. They have the strongest currents. And the sand is the bottom is mostly sand. It could be mud, but it could also have gravel or shell as a bottom. If we move toward the shore from the subtidal channels, you start to have portions of the estuary that are alternately exposed and submerged by the tides. Those ones that are closest to the shore of the open water channels tend to be unvegetated, and they tend to be sandy or muddy environments. Remember, estuaries are sediment accumulation areas. The rivers deliver sediments, they land there because the currents are slow. The ocean delivers sediments at the mouth because the waves wash things into a flood tide delta. So these are soft sediment environments and dominated by soft sediments. So in the example of Coos Bay, about half of Coos Bay, the surface area, is these unvegetated tide flats. Some portions of these tide flats actually have rooted vegetation on them. And they deserve a special category and special consideration. You'll hear more about these toward the tail end of my presentation, but these are seagrass beds or eelgrass beds, some people refer to them. They're actually flowering plants that are rooted to the sediments or have roots that are running around in the sediments, very grass-like creatures, very important. As the tide comes up, the blades create this three-dimensional environment where in that unvegetated tide flat world right next to it, it's just a sand bottom and a column of water over it. Another type of life zone within an estuary is an oyster reef. Now, these are very important areas in the Gulf of Mexico and in the Southeast Atlantic area, Chesapeake Bay. At one time, they were very important natural habitats here in the Pacific Northwest with native oysters. But in Oregon's estuaries, native oysters are functionally extinct. They still exist in small numbers, but never to the degree that they had been historically. They've been replaced with large-scale commercial oyster production using a non-native species, the giant Pacific oyster that's native to Asia and Japan. You can see that these oyster beds create roughness on this unvegetated tide flat. The surface is much more rough, so there's more friction and nooks and crannies there. So these oyster beds are really important for trapping sediments in a similar fashion that the roughness of the blades of seagrasses are important for trapping sediments. As we move further up to the upper limits of the tidal influence, we find a habitat that is called a salt marsh or a tidal marsh. They can also grow in a freshwater environment where the river just gets backed up by the tides. So the river level just goes up and down with the tides, and salt water may never even get to that part. So these tidal marshes are really important. They're excellent at trapping sediments. And we'll hear a little bit more about their functions at the end of my presentation as well. There's a little graph in the bottom left that was an inventory that was done in 1974, which is the first year I came to the Oregon coast. And they've identified that there's about nearly 2,000 acres of marshes in Coos Bay, salt marshes or tidal marshes in Coos Bay. And there's nearly 4,000 acres of historic marshes that have been isolated from tidal influence by dikes and tide gates. And those of you who have been to the Bandon Marsh area recently, that's an example of a historic marsh that was diked and tide gated, and restoration actions have taken place to remove the dikes and tide gates and reestablish tidal circulation there. And we'll get a little bit more of that later. Okay, so now I am getting an update from the University of Oregon, which I don't need. Then finally, a very, very interesting life zone in an estuary is this thing called a tidal swamp forest. And many of you are probably unfamiliar with a tidal swamp forest because less than 1% of the original tidal swamp forests that occurred in Oregon's estuaries occur today. These are the most highly impacted estuarine habitats of any. And there's only vestiges of those because these are the upper reaches of tidal influence. They grew the biggest trees in their day, and it was in these lowland areas that lend themselves ideally to the conversion for agricultural use. So our introduction identified that estuaries are pretty important places. They don't show up very large on a map of our state, but I consider them hot spots. These things are some of the most productive places on the planet, and we happen to find value in there for any number of reasons. It was hard to find a parking place at Coastal Mist today, so I attribute some of that responsibility to the beautiful scenic attributes that are afforded by the Coquille Estuary. But they're really important for fish. They're really important for wildlife. They have these diverse habitats that are found nowhere else that I just profiled for you. But they're also really important to human civilization. They're centers of commerce. They're actually the centers of human civilization. If we had to find a place, are people familiar with the Endangered Species Act? One of the things, if a bird is listed or an animal is listed as threatened or in danger of extinction, the very first thing that law requires people to do is to describe essential habitat. And I've just asked you to do the thought exercise to say, if our species was in danger of extinction and the aegis of the Endangered Species Act were applied to us, what would you classify as essential habitat, critical habitat? I would say the critical habitat for our species is the mouth of a river. Why do you just say Coastal Mist? I'll defend it with my life. So we're mixing it up here. We've got these rich biological values, or perhaps part of the attraction to us because they're great places to dig clam, and they provide these real supportive services for us. Okay, third key point, right? We've got estuaries, sea level's a big deal. We've got salinity gradients are a big deal. And now dynamics are a big deal. These are really highly variable systems, and they're variable on centuries time scale. We talked about that, 400 feet of sea level rise, that'll change a shoreline for you. They're variable on a monthly scale, an annual scale, summer, winter. We'll get into that a little bit. They're variable on an hourly scale, high tide, low tide, foggy, not foggy. So estuaries are dynamic places. On a irregular basis, we have things like earthquakes that change the land level. So in a subduction zone environment like we are, when a large scale local earthquake happens, the land level sinks 3 feet. And it stays 3 feet lower. What does that mean to our perception of sea level? That means sea level rises 3 feet and stays 3 feet higher. So we have to keep these dynamics in mind when we think about how we interact with these systems. So I'll just pick one example of estuary dynamics. Since it's winter and we're finally getting a breather from all this rain we've been having, we've been hearing about the atmospheric rivers in California. We've been at the edge of a couple of those, but we've seen our own. They maybe didn't get hammered quite so hard this year, but we get them. Well, that means that the rivers that are flowing into the Coos estuary have, just even on average, without a peak discharge event, the average winter flows are 64 times larger than the average summer flows. So what does that mean then for that salinity gradient? Let's take a look. So this is a map. We've seen the salinity gradient. Is this a familiar picture now? This is the river, this is the ocean, this is the river, this is the ocean. So this is winter time in the left-hand column and summertime in the right-hand column. This is the north spit of the Coos estuary. The red on the left-hand side is a slice of the ocean. Are we following? So it's a map of Coos Bay. The airport's up here at North Bend. We all know that North Bend, it's the North Bend of the estuary. Okay. Well, anyway, in wintertime, you can see blue water is fresh water, and blue water is coming in to the upper part of the estuary at kilometer 25, which is just up off the map here. You can see that fresh water starting to float on top of the salt water. So it's fresher on top than it is on the bottom. So we have that salt wedge type estuary situation going on, salinity gradient going on in the winter time. Here's the fresh water coming in from the rivers, and then it's getting gradually salty. And we're actually diluting a little bit. We're diluting the ocean a little bit with fresh water. And I'm sure if you've stood up looking down at the mouth of the Coquille River when it's really raging and there's a lot of sediment, you can see the sediment pulse moving out into the ocean. On the right is summer season, and you can see it's a traditional salinity gradient where the salinity is the same top to bottom. Not much river discharge. The ocean is really controlling the salinity gradient in the summer. Humans are part of the dynamics. And I've tried to make this so that this is not a doom and gloom discussion, although it would have been very easy to do that. We really like these places, and we really work them pretty hard. So we do all kinds of things to adjust them to our needs, and to tap into their values. And I've listed a few things here and illustrated a few things here. But we can also do things that aren't so doom and gloom. We can actually help them out. We can clean them up. We can put things back that we've taken away that we want to have back again. So we can clean them up. We can farm them with aquaculture. We can control introduced species. We can weed them, I guess is a thought of it. And we can interact with them. We can do things with them. And the things that we do with them don't all have to be that kind of in the doom and gloom category of the spreadsheet. So let's just do a run through how we've been interacting with estuaries for the last 10,000 years or so. And there's very clear archaeological evidence right here in Bandon, in fact, where an archaeological dig has taken place right across from where they have the farmers market. I don't know if everyone's been to that little kiosk, but human beings have interacted with Oregon's estuaries for at least the last 7,000 years. And that pretty much indicates that the estuaries that we see today have been continuously occupied since they've taken the form that they have following the last ice age. So then Western civilization came. There was a management approach by those first people that were here. And when Western civilization came, the fur traders, the settlers that came in the 1850s, they brought their value system with them and created another era of management. So on a macro scale, for the last 10,000 years, Oregon's estuaries have been under two fundamentally different management regimes. And I'll just give you a few profiles of what those two management regimes have been. So the first phase is this management regime where estuaries were managed by indigenous cultures. And that starts, again, when these estuaries took their current form, roughly 10,000 years ago, and was pretty much continuous up until 1850, which is really the time in which European American civilizations colonized this area and really started to, and brought their values with them and started to bring their management ideas along. So that first 10,000 years of management really had the cultures interacting with these estuaries as a place where they had provisioning services. They got clams, they got fish, they had life support services from these estuaries. And they gardened estuaries. There's some really fantastic examples of clam gardens up in British Columbia where people actually farmed clams. They made little enclosures and did that. But they also created fish capture structures. But that provisioning services were so important to these cultures that it actually became their culture. It was crossing over to what we would call religion, but it's a life way that integrates the functions of these estuaries into it's an embodiment of the entire culture. So that's the first 10,000 years. This is what it looked like. The bottom left image is a photograph that was taken in Yaquina Bay of a family out on Yaquina Bay harvesting native oysters. And if you look up in the top left image, that's an oyster shell midden that is 6,000 years old. So there's evidence of active interaction with the biological productivity of the estuary for the last 6,000 years. The center picture there is some dredge spoil materials that were dredged up from Coos Bay and piled up in east side at the Millicoma Marsh Trail in the upper reaches of Coos Bay. And that white material in the foreground is more native oysters that were dredged from the bottom of the bay than sediment. So that upper reaches of Coos Bay has historically supported oyster beds that were more shell than they were sediments. The map on the right would show the management structure. These are the different languages of people. And each one of these people oriented themselves to Oregon's estuaries. And in fact, today, the languages of those people are reflected in the names we give the estuaries. The people and the estuary were the same in that time. This is how people interacted with the estuaries in its day. The bottom left image and the top right image are vestiges of fish weir structures in the Coos estuary. I learned this week that the Coos estuary has the richest assemblage of indigenous fish weirs of any estuary in the United States. Some of these little sticks that have been placed in the mud are 6,000 years old. So it's really cool to know that there's that kind of history in our estuaries. The Bandon National Wildlife Refuge had a massive archaeological research program for this the project they call wet archaeology. And that's where these small woven basketry that were associated with these fish weirs fell into the oxygen-free mud environment and have been preserved for thousands of years. Then, around 1850, a new management regime was introduced, and that was a management regime that was introduced by Euro-American cultures, and that began around in the mid to late 1850s and has carried on to what I would say, there's sort of been two phases of this up until about 1970. And that phase is what I call the manifest destiny phase of management. And that was, I just said it in one sentence, extensive unregulated resource extraction, habitat removal and alteration. Okay, so remember, we're coming off of 10,000 years, and now we're talking about 120 years. And then the second phase of that started in the 1970s, which I call the hierarchical land use planning phase. And we'll get to a little bit more of that, where we tried to slow this rate of change down, and we tried to plan ahead, where it was kind of take it as you can get it in this manifest destiny phase. This is an example of the manifest destiny phase. The graph at the bottom is the harvest of native oysters, commercial harvest of native oysters, which spiked, the first spike was about in 1897. And that carried on until about 1910, it completely collapsed, or 1915, it completely collapsed. It had a little rebound, and there's been functional extinction since the 1960s for native oyster harvest in the Pacific Northwest estuaries. So that's pretty quick. The other thing that we started to do is we brought out other sets of values. Coos Bay, the city of Coos Bay, is the school group is called Marsh Field. Well, that's because the yellow portion in this map was actually historic tidelands. This is a map of downtown Coos Bay, and truly and literally, the town was a marsh field. And if you drive around downtown Coos Bay, you can actually see that reflected in the architecture. The buildings that are up on the hill are older structures than the ones that are down in the flats at the bottom. The reason why Coos Bay is where it is because it's near Bunker Hill. And early explorers here exploited the coal beds that were in the southern portion of the estuary. So the main center of human civilization in Coos Bay was Western European civilization, was sited 16 miles from the ocean because it was right near where the coal was. And that's where the people lived who mined the coal and developed the estuary for export of that initial coal product. Of course, then that moved to, there needed to be an agricultural food production support system. That's where the tidal swamp forests got converted and dikes and levees were constructed to provide for agricultural products to support this new industrial activity on the shore of the bay. Did I skip past one? Yeah, here we go. So this is from a research project that looks at Washington, Oregon, and California. They checked in on 55 different estuaries and started to do some calculations of what was the historic wetland area versus the existing wetland area. And I picked two examples out of that. The Coos estuaries lost over 70% of the original wetland areas through filling, diking, and draining. And the Coquille estuary has lost over 90% of those historic tidal wetlands. So I think of a school district that has 5 major areas. You know, you got kindergarten and pre-K, you got elementary, you got middle school, you got the high school, and then you have the special services district. So that's a system, a school system that has 5 major elements. If you cut the budget of the middle school by 90%, would you still have a school district? Well, that's what we've done to estuaries in Oregon. And I'll show you what that looks like. This is the Tillamook estuary. The area that's in red was historic tidal wetlands. And that's an area of tidal wetlands that have been removed from the Tillamook estuary. This is what it looks graphically. This is the historical amount of blue is forested wetlands. Green is emergent or marshes, and the gray, this intermediate is a shrub scrub environment, which is, you know where the little visitor turnout is, the viewpoint is for the abandoned marsh thing right at the edge of town? That shrubby stuff that you walk through between that little band there is a shrub scrub forest, tidal shrub scrub. So that's that kind of habitat. This is what it looks like today. You can see how much the blue area, which is the historically forested tidelands, these tidal swamp forests, how much that has been diminished in. That's throughout Oregon. And you can see how that measures out in area, which you can see that it's, you know, these very high percentages. This is the Coquille River estuary. And in this case, the blue area is historical forested wetlands. These are historical forested wetlands. Bandon is down here, right? Where our Bandon is here. Here are these little 2 hot spots, Bandon Marsh National Wildlife Refuge. That's the Naleston unit. Highway 101 coming right down through. And this is heading over Myrtle Point, Coquille Way. So all that Winter Lake Valley was historically a tidal swamp forest. So that was that. Those are the changes that were brought during that 120-year phase of manifest destiny management, okay? People started to recognize that, wow, this is going pretty fast and it's not going very well for some situations. We have fisheries issues now. We have extinction of shellfish. We have other issues. We have pollution and contamination. We should be a little bit more careful about how we do this. So our state, in its wisdom, adopted land use planning regulations in the 1970s. So the legislature passed laws, and the public agencies that were directed to implement the laws passed these regulations and rules. And those values were articulated in a series of 19 statewide planning goals. And about the same era, they said, wow, this wetland filling and this dredging is pretty intense. There was another law passed in the 1970s called the Oregon Fill and Removal Law, assigned to a state agency to regulate and require permits for people who want to place fill material in a wetland or remove material from a wetland. So the early 70s was a big era where we reflecting a change in the management. Well, here's those 19 goals, and a number of them explicitly map out estuaries. Goal 16 and goal 17 are highly important. They require local planning agencies, county and city planning agencies that live on the shore of an estuary to create these estuary management plans and incorporate them in their comprehensive land use plans. So, and explicitly, these goals recognize that estuaries were important and required special planning for estuaries and special planning for the shoreline of estuaries. But now we realize that they also required, back in the 1970s, us to think about areas that were subject to natural disasters and hazards. But most importantly, reigning overall, this goal number one is Oregon's going to do it their way, and they're going to do it with citizen input. So in the 70s, how did we start to look at all of Oregon's estuaries and say, what are we going to do with them? Because in the 70s, there were some that were developed as high intensity deep draft ports. Some of them were just sitting down there like New River. Some had jetties, some didn't. And so they put a time stamp on these estuaries, and they carved out 3 deep draft development estuaries where dredges were already operating: Coos Bay, Newport, and Estuary. And then they have shallow draft development estuaries. Those are estuaries that have jetties, but they don't really accommodate large merchant vessels. So the Coquille River is an example of that. And then there's estuaries that don't have jetties, that aren't dredged, but they still have things going on, like Alsea Bay up in Waldport. Those were designated for conservation because there was other activities that meant that they weren't fully natural systems, but they had other values besides just natural. And then there was these ones that were largely untouched that tended to be smaller, that were given this classification as natural estuaries. This map shows you what came out of that hierarchical process. This is a map of the zones within the Coos Estuary. This is an image taken straight out of the Estuary Management Plan. This plan was adopted in 1984 and is administered in Coquille at the county courthouse by the county planners. The areas of the estuary that are within the incorporated portion of the city of North Bend and the city of Coos Bay, they also have responsibilities within those zones. It's complicated. And it was the best shot. And I can tell you that many of the leaders in Coos County hated the idea of ending the era of manifest destiny, because life was simpler then. If you wanted to do something, you did it. And now you got to get permission to do it. And as you well know, that doesn't sit well with many in our community. And so what I treat this incredibly complex, heroic effort by our planning department is a minimum performance document. In fact, it was completed under a court order requiring it to be completed. But they're really important. I won't tell you that this is a perfect plan, but I'll tell you that it's better than no plan. I can tell you that I can show you the scars of the most acid-bath test I've ever had of this estuary management plan. And that was this most recent proposal to develop a liquefied natural gas export terminal in Coos Bay. It was a $10 billion project. They pushed for 17 years to achieve this. There were thousands of jobs at stake. And the project was withdrawn because it was determined under a court of appeals to be inconsistent with the estuary management plan. So that tells me that this estuary is worth more than $10 billion. And I'm really pleased to say it was, I'm not pleased to say it wasn't easy. It sure as heck wasn't easy, but I'm really pleased to say that that estuary management plan was the pillar that was the decision-making document, and it wouldn't have happened without citizen involvement. So now, 40-some years later, into this hierarchical phase, our county is working to try and revise for the first time ever the estuary management plan. This is the part I want you folks to recognize. There's a screenshot off of the Coos County Planning Department's office. There has been some tremendous work, several $1 million worth of effort going into updating the maps. Where does stuff live now, 40 years later? What does it look like? What shape is it in? What activities or industries are important to us? 40 years ago, we used the estuary to store and transport log. That was discontinued in the 1990s. We have special zones in the estuary that were designed to accommodate log storage and transportation. That's not a use we value anymore. We'll probably have to rethink what to do there. So what does the future hold for estuaries in Oregon? A little window on the past. Well, right now I'm working very actively to track 3 large-scale development proposals for the Coos Estuary that are in play right now. One of them is a large-scale container terminal that is proposed to divert about 10% of the traffic that's going into Los Angeles Long Beach container terminal to Coos Bay. There's a lot of active discussion about the development and use of Coos Bay as a site to build, construct, and support offshore wind development. And there's also a proposal running right now to do a multi-purpose bulk container facility and tank farm. All of these on the north spit of the Coos Estuary. So we will continue to decide whether or not these projects are consistent with our estuary management plan. All the while, we're trying to revise it and modernize it to reflect our new value system. So we have learned quite a few things in the last 40 or 50 years. We know now that instead of these systems being these snapshots where you can freeze time, we know the estuaries are dynamic. We know about things we never knew about, like tsunamis and subduction zone earthquakes. We know about things now that we should plan for, like climate change and sea level rise, which we weren't thinking about when we adopted these original plans. So I'll just profile sea level for you as one of these dynamics that have come to light and show you what that might look like. People are mapping sea level rise. It's not speculative, you can map it. What most people don't realize is about half of the measured increase in sea level that we're experiencing right now is not coming from the melting of glaciers that we all know about. Half of it is coming because the water in the ocean is warming up. And when you warm up water, it expands. So it's called thermal expansion. And half of the measured sea level rise is associated with thermal expansion. We've put a lot of carbon dioxide, heat trapping chemicals into the atmosphere. The atmosphere has trapped that heat, but it takes centuries to transfer that heat to the ocean. So you can expect, like it says here in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that past emissions and future emissions will mean that sea level will continue to rise for more than 1,000 years. If we stop emitting new greenhouse gases today, sea level will rise for the next 1,000 years because of thermal expansion. This is what it looks like. So what happens to these ecosystems when sea level rise? We saw that original map. Sea level was 400 feet lower. Estuaries have survived through 400 feet of sea level rise. How does that work? Well, when sea level rises, you have a life zone like a salt marsh living at average high water in an estuary. Well, if the water gets higher, the marsh is going to have to match it. And so that's called landward retreat or marsh migration. The marsh works its way upland. You lose marsh at the bottom when they get drowned by being submerged too much from increased sea level. But hopefully they can trap enough sediments to hold their head above the water and move inland to migrate. Well, so that's how that works. But there's a limit to how these are living systems. They're plants. You can overwater a plant and drown it. Your house plants can do that. You can do the same with a marsh. And people have been modeling marshes to say, well, all right, if you add the right amount of sediment, the soil levels will rise and keep pace with sea level. And you can do that between 1 and 10 centimeters of sea level rise, okay, or 10 millimeters of sea level rise. So every 10 years you get 10 centimeters, or you get a millimeter, right? Millimeter, yep, 1 millimeter a year. So every 10 years you get a centimeter. So that's how much average sea level rises. You can do that, and the marsh will keep pace with up to 10 millimeters of sea level rise a year. That is, unless you sort of hurt the marsh or damage the vegetation, then it can't keep up and the whole thing unravels. And that's what those bottom illustrations demonstrate. So it is possible for marshes to respond to sea level rise and keep pace. But we have a situation in Oregon where almost half of all the remaining marshes, which remember are 10% of what the original marsh inventory was, half of those that are left are in this situation that you call salt marsh squeeze. And that's because we built roads and levees along the edges of the estuary. You got a little fringe of marsh there. If sea level rises in those situations, there's no place for the marsh to retreat, and you end up with this thing called marsh squeeze. So again, that doesn't sound all that encouraging, but I guess I can say, can we adapt to these changes that we're not going to be able to avoid? And I thought, as I paused to think that, to say, well, you know what? What other choices do we have? You know, yes, we're going to, but we might be able to, we might be able to dance with it a little bit as opposed to just let it happen. So this is back in 2007 when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was having its 4th meeting. And they're just saying that we're going to have to adapt, because at the time in 2007, we were saying, well, maybe we could keep these changes from happening. And back in 2007, they said, no, these changes are inevitable. There are situations where we're actually just going to have to adapt to whatever these changes are that are the consequences of this climate. So this is an example of a roadway going across Kentucky Slough with a newly installed tide gate. And I'm just trying to think, well, if we give 10 millimeters of sea level rise, how long is this thing going to last? Our estuary management plan, last one, was good for 40 years. I don't think this one's going to go too well in 40 years. We're already starting to see it. I chatted with one fellow who's taking these pictures of, have you heard of this King Tide project, where on the really high lunar tides with fresh water, you go out and take pictures and, oh, this road's flooded, or this beach is, this parking lot has water in it, or this sewer plate on Highway 101 in downtown Coos Bay is turned into a geyser because the bay level's higher than Highway 101. It's just like, ooh. So that's something we need to consider, but we also need to figure out how to adapt. We've got storm drains, we've got sewer lines that are at risk from this. Our water supply systems, we've got ponded water in Jonay Slough, and that's providing drinking water for 60,000 people in the Coos Bay North End Water Board. We're going to have some places where it's going to be essential to defend a shoreline, like downtown Coos Bay, but there's going to be other places that are just ending up going to be lower priority. They're going to be expensive to fix or to adjust. And I don't think we're going to get to it all. So, and now we have this whole business of subduction zone earthquakes. We have this business of tsunamis, which we never had 40 years ago. And these maps now that the planning department is considering are showing the tsunami inundation maps. They're showing the subduction maps. They're showing the landslide maps. They're showing the fire maps. So, in addition to managing development activities, which is what really that first phase of these estuary management plans was, to try and kind of put a lid on or make developing these estuaries a little bit more thoughtful process. Now we've got these other factors that are impinging, these new hazards that we're doing. So I think as we revise these estuary management plans, we could start to look at this huge legacy of that manifest destiny phase. The estuary management plans that were adopted in 1984 drew a line at 1984 and said, where are we going to go from here? And they circled the bay. They even drew maps that say, this is the estuary. They left out places that used to be estuary. But in the context of sea level rise, are going to be those places that are most likely to become estuary again, if we take a little bit longer time frame for it. So let's just say I've flagged for you important stuff about estuaries. How many people are convinced now estuaries are important? Show of hands here. All right, I'm doing my job. Well, I'm going to pick out to say, well, okay, let's now talk about how we want to manage our estuaries next. I mean, we had 10,000 years followed by 120 years followed by 50. And how are we going to do it the next 50? And that's going to be a stretch for us, but I think that's the dilemma, that's the circumstance we're in right now. So let's just go back to say eelgrass. I flagged that is the most important, right? I just said, boy, fish, whatever. It's super important stuff, trapping sediments. Let's just show you how complicated it is. So here's eelgrass at high tide, showing that three-dimensional environment. This is your plant again. So here you are, docents. If you're looking to understand how eelgrass works, this is the seed pod of these things. These are flowering plants that shed their seeds and pollen into the water. And the seeds are fertilized by pollen floating around in the water. Pretty sophisticated, pretty complicated botany. There's only a couple species of plants on the planet that figured out how to do this. But once they figured it out, they really do a good job at it. And it turns out they're integral parts of the whole estuary system. There's a whole bunch of give and take and back and forth between this key habitat and other things that we value very highly in an estuary. So again, at high tide, that three-dimensional structure comes up. There's a group of organisms that use this environment as a place to live. So this is a picture of a bay pipefish. It's found in our estuaries. Well, if your eelgrass bed is at the edge of a channel, the bay pipefish comes up and lives in that at high tide, but it drops down to the subtidal portion of it. But if you have a meadow out on a tide flat that dewaters, that's not going to work for a bay pipefish. So where the eelgrass is really important. There's a whole community of living things that lives inside eelgrass, on the bottom, underneath it. There's a whole nother community of organisms that live on the blades of eelgrass, which is called epiphytes. Epiphyte, on the plants on the surface, epiphyte, phytoplankton. There's a little picture of a sea slug that grazes those epiphytes. So it's a whole community of organisms. Underneath the sediments, I said these are rooted plants. These are the yellow-brown image in the image here are the rhizomes of the underground that were exposed during a real high wave environment near the mouth of Coos Bay. And some of those areas were completely removed, and I was astounded. That's where I live. And I walked out there after the edge of this eelgrass bed got peeled back by a big winter storm. That's the clam density underneath an eelgrass bed. So they're pretty important. And then it's so important, and they've been around long enough that there's another group of organisms that are what I call eelgrass dependent species. They're obligate eelgrass associates. The black-brant goose is an example. It eats eelgrass and it flies from one estuary to the next, clear on up into Alaska, eating eelgrass. And so it's pretty important to protect eelgrass. These are, that's a picture of brant geese down in the lower part of the bay that come each year in spring, right after the herring have come to spawn. The next is here's some American widgeons that are grazing on some of the eelgrass that the brant geese have torn up from the bottom because they have longer necks. But then there's also a whole group of organisms that use eelgrass as a place to breed. And I've shown an example here of herring who come in each spring right around Valentine's Day and spawn, attach their eggs to the blades of eelgrass. And on the image on the left, you can see it's kind of a light, hazy, grayish color. That's because those are eggs of herring that spawn onto this eelgrass. So I can tell you that there's an ocean worth of herring spawn on a couple of maybe 50 acres of eelgrass in the lower part of Coos Bay. And they just finished doing it. And when they do it, word gets out immediately. This is a group of surf scoters that are feeding on that, and I'll show you this little poorly produced video, but this is scoter action here. I took this with my cell phone, so apologies for the
Nice capture.
things get a little crazy. This year there's been 10 bald eagles protecting the herring eggs from these ducks. When the bald eagle flows over, things get really crazy. There were 7 juveniles and 3 adults. There's the lower bay, there's the North Spit. This is at Fossil Point. There's the entrance to the harbor. The herring come in and spawn for 1 or 2 days. Seals and sea lions alert us because in the middle of the night, California sea lions are barking. Pretty awesome, huh? And then after that, the scops show up. You got enough? Lousy video. Anyway, there they are. The gulls show up at low tide, so there's kind of like shift work going on, timeshare. It's an interesting year this year. The other thing that happens is there's a whole ocean worth of crabs use these estuaries as well. These little tiny things here are the pre-settlement larvae of Dungeness crabs. And this is one evening's capture hanging a 5-gallon jug off the edge of the dock in Charleston with a light in it. And overnight, you can collect tens of thousands of these juvenile Dungeness crab. This is the most valuable fishery in Oregon. And these are ester-independent species. So it's pretty important how we look after these things. So eelgrass is productive enough that when it gets torn up or ripped up, it actually provides environment, habitat, and fertilization to the ocean. I've been 60 miles off the coast of Oregon tuna fishing, and there's eelgrass floating around on an ocean front where 2 different ocean fronts come together. The only place that eelgrass comes from is our estuaries. There's a crab hanging out in an eelgrass bed. So let's protect this stuff, right? Well, here's a map of our state, or a part of our state, that shows everywhere that eelgrass occurs. When you get down to saying, how are we going to protect this? You just go, uh-oh, there's 2 different kinds of eelgrass here. One of them was introduced probably in ballast water from a ship from Japan. It's called Zostra japonica. And the other one is one that's been here all along. It's called Zostra marina. So one's native and one's non-native. And of course, non-native species are bad, right? Yeah. So that's complicated. California treats non-native eelgrass as a pest. Washington manages for it. Oregon doesn't have a policy for it. So here we are to say, okay, here's our estuary management plan. How are we doing at protecting eelgrass? And all this other dots and stuff. But the map on the right actually shows where eelgrass was in, I think, 2004. So it's just like, well, when you see that blue area, that's natural aquatic. So those are areas that are to be managed for nature. Those dark blue areas, and you just say, well, you know, up here, that's pretty good. That's in this natural aquatic. So, and down here, that's blue, that's natural aquatic. That's pretty good. So the estuary management plan has picked up on the fact, and as we recognized in '84 that eelgrass was important, and we've done a pretty good job at it. Here's what just showing this eelgrass coverage for the Coos estuary. The native eelgrass is about just over 10% of the total area of the bay, but the non-native is about 20% of the total area of the bay. And Tillamook Bay, it's kind of a similar situation. There's a lot more native eelgrass in Tillamook Bay. There's 34% of the bay is covered with eelgrass, but only 10% of the bay is covered with non-native eelgrass. So there's that. But then there's also this notion that eelgrass is dynamic. This is a map of Yaquina Bay. And on the left was the maximum extent of eelgrass, showing in green. And on the right is where the eelgrass was in 2012. So why is that? I don't know. I call this the estuary salute. But now we're checking in on our estuary management plan. We probably mapped eelgrass when it was like that in '84 and created all those zones. This is what eelgrass, this is more or less what eelgrass looks like. And the people who are in Yaquina Bay trying to develop their estuary management plans are trying to figure out, okay, we need to protect eelgrass, right? Does that mean that it's kind of wide open here? Because it's not there anymore. And there were clearly people that would be happy to know about that. The people that worked for Pembina, the Canadian gas pipeline company, would have been, they did their mapping and said, we will need to compensate for any eelgrass damage. And they were thrilled that there was a lot less eelgrass around when they did their surveys. This is what eelgrass does if you look carefully at it. This is a map of eelgrass populations in the South Slough Inlet of Coos Bay from 2004 to 2020. It's a moving target, is basically. There's 4 different lines here. That's 4 different locations in the South Slough Inlet. And suffice to say that in 2017, eelgrass populations in the most highly protected portion of the bay in the South Slough Inlet, the place that I manage, I didn't know this was happening. I was retired. The populations collapsed. This is what it looks like. 2016, we're part of a global eelgrass monitoring program. You go out and do these structured protocols. 2002, eelgrass everywhere. 2016, starting to see mud. 2017, 2018, gone. So if we're revising our estuary management plan, what do you pick for your spot? How do you manage eelgrass? How do you draw on a map where eelgrass is? Can we actually consider this dynamic nature of these estuaries as we plan on how we're going to go forward from here? And the eelgrass was just one example, but there are plenty of other examples here. Our water quality changes. Have people heard of ocean acidification and harmful algal blooms, calves? Well, those things are playing out in Oregon's estuaries as well. We've got this loss of habitat, this huge legacy of habitat loss and alteration. We've got habitats changing around inside the park that still remains. There's diseases have people tracked the disease of the sea stars? Yeah. Right? So that's nothing we have anything to do with that we know of. They just all of a sudden started dying and we just watched it happen. And then we have these big catastrophes that we know are cued in. We have vessel groundings, we have earthquakes, we have tsunamis. So let's go back to this example for eelgrass. I think, excuse me if I may, I put an asterisk next to those 5 items. 4 of those 5 items, I think, are items that could be addressed in an estuary management plan. A management plan, a plan is to say what we want things to be like in the future. Not what things, we need to know what things are like now, but we, like the urban renewal agencies, identifies a blighted community. They say, these are the actions we're going to take to eliminate the blight. I think you could apply the same planning model to estuaries. And I think you could make a case that these are blighted ecosystems. So, but standing by and watching, which has been our practice in the past, is probably not going to get us where we want to go. So I think active measures are absolutely essential to getting where we want to go. If we want that eelgrass back from that 2000 to the 2002 maximum extent, because we value it, the geese, for the crabs, for everything else that it's good for, we're probably going to have to take steps to get it to come back. And fortunately, we're beginning to have the tools that allow us to do that kind of manipulation and management. But I'll throw one more thing in. I'm wrapping up here. I know I've run long. We know about this beast of climate change, this beast that surrounds us. There's some discussion now just to say, well, what can we do to move the needle on climate change? How can we steer climate change? How can we consider, could estuaries play a role in this whole climate change dialogue? And when we talk about climate change, we talk about bending the curve, the heat capturing capabilities of the atmosphere. And I'll direct you to this bottom maps. This is an Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change graph. They're modeling the future. This is from 2005 to 2095, a reasonable planning period. That would be a reasonable timeline for the lifespan of our next estuary management plan. And this orange line is this thing called CCS, which is called carbon capture and storage. And you can see that wedge gets bigger and it actually bends the curve. And this is emissions. We're trying to lower the rate that we're adding things to the atmosphere. And one way you can bend that curve is to take things out of the atmosphere through a process called carbon capture. And there's a whole bunch of strategies for carbon capture that you might be hearing about, injecting carbon dioxide into old oil wells, that kind of thing. I'll just talk to you about estuary, the role that estuaries might play. There's a group of people working now on this concept called blue carbon. Estuaries are rich places for plants, and highly productive plants. Salt marshes are very productive places. So their plants photosynthesize, they take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and turn it into plant. And they turn it into seeds and stems and roots. And depending on the fate of those things, they can store that carbon dioxide they've taken out of the atmosphere for a long time. But wetlands are also a source of emissions. Some people have smelled the marsh, the sulfur smell of the oxygen-free sediments. That's a sulfur emission from biological activity and chemical activities that are releasing gases from the marsh into the atmosphere that we can smell. So they could also release carbon dioxide. And interestingly enough, I'll just get to that in a point here. This is a schematic section through some soil. We've had some plants on it, some marsh plants on it. They also have things in the deep ocean that don't really relate to this conversation. But the point here is all these little C's are talking about carbon sequestration into the soil. And remember I mentioned that some of these marshes are 10,000 years old. They've been storing carbon in the soil for 10,000 years, which is a pretty good record. In fact, it's an even better record than forests. Because once these marshes grow these plants, grow their roots, the oxygen doesn't penetrate the soil very well, and they go oxygen free, and that preserves any of the material that's down in that oxygen free zone. Sea level rises, sediments get trapped, the marsh moves up, marsh moves up, marsh moves up. There's 10,000 years of stored carbon in the peat soils of these salt marshes. If you put a dike on a tidal wetland or a swamp forest and drain the water from it so you can convert it to agricultural use or upland environment, that exposes all that stored carbon in the peats of the soils of the marshes and the forest to oxygen, and it oxidizes and it becomes a potent source of greenhouse gases. Because the plants start to decompose, and decomposition, the bacteria that decompose that plant material produce carbon dioxide. So these diked salt marshes that we have on the shores of these estuaries are potent sources contributing carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And there's some research scientists that are looking at places like San Francisco Bay going, oh my gosh, we could reflood these things, reestablish oxygen-free conditions, and stop that bleeding of carbon dioxide and the oxidization of those peats that are in the soils. This graph just shows what a tidal forest, how it can store carbon. This is compared to other areas of marsh in Brazil. These are marshes in the Pacific Northwest. Here's seagrasses. You can see how much below ground carbon gets stored in a tidal forest compared to a marsh. But you can see that the storage of carbon of these tidal marshes it's a whole below ground thing. If you compare these things, here's an Oregon coast old growth, above ground and below ground storage. We think of these majestic forests. They're storing carbon big time. They're one of the best places to store carbon. A clear case for allowing trees to get old. But here's a marsh. Look how much of that they're storing. And here's a tidal forest that's actually capable of storing more carbon in the soil than an old growth forest is. Yes, ma'am.
Is the freshwater marsh comparable, or is the saltwater higher?
They behave differently, and I don't know the soil chemistry well enough, but the people whose work I'm reading on this blue carbon group recognize that respiration in a freshwater marsh where gases would be released to the atmosphere is different than respiration in a saltwater marsh. So yes, it depends. There is a difference between fresh and salt. I'm sorry, I won't be able to explain that.
That's okay.
So anyway, that was the answer to my question. Could we use these estuaries as a place to bend the curve for some value that we never even considered in 1984? And the answer through my inquiry to that is yes. And so I would like to just thank you for your additional attention that you never bargained for, and would love to open up for questions. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
I didn't catch why did the eelgrass population suddenly drop in Coos Bay? It was healthy. Did you guys?
The question was, why did the population of eelgrass decline so precipitously, like around 2017? It didn't decline everywhere in the estuary, but in particular, it declined in South Slough, which has more scientists looking at it than any other place in the coast. And they have some ideas, but there isn't a smoking gun. You know, we had this extreme temperature, this ocean blob. Have you heard about this blob thing? The South Slough has good monitoring equipment. They can measure tides, water clarity, salinity. They can also measure temperature. And they did see an uptick. And this eelgrass is fussy stuff. And it's not fully understood by any means. But right now, the best idea that is circulating amongst Ali Helms and the research crew at South Slough is that it might have been a thermal stress issue. And I can't make that work in my mind because Charleston is the foggy, cooler spot closer to the ocean. You would think up the bay, outside of the fog belt, on the big open tide flats would heat up more, but it could be the genome. You know, some plants may be more sensitive to others. Some of us are more vulnerable to COVID than others. You know, it could be the resiliency. They could have been under some long-term multiple stressors from a seafood processing facility. You know, it's all speculation.
Sure. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Given our current situation, both politically, economic, and socially, how do you see those things interacting with trying to produce a good plan? And do you see them interacting? You know, I know that's a huge question.
Yeah, it is, but it's an excellent
point of view. How do you
It's an
see
excellent
that,
question. Well,
the current environment.
I pointed out how important goal 1 is citizen participation. And I am a proud Oregonian to know that Oregon takes that to heart. Every one of us would like to be king. And we've got all our culture focused on this place. We live on its shorelines. We catch its fish. We admire its views. Each of us, I think, has a vision for it. But what we really need is a collective vision. And at the heart of any viable democracy should be and will be a lively conversation. And what I'm really impinging upon you or am begging you to do is get involved in that conversation. It's playing out right now. And I can tell you people with big stakes are paying really careful attention, because they want to do things in the estuary that some other people may not find as valuable to do. But they have resources to accomplish that. This was a large corporation that none of us ever heard from Canada that came to the shore of Coos Bay to build a liquefied natural gas export terminal, a $10 billion project. Well, I'll tell you, wind energy makes liquefied natural gas look like a fly speck. We have the largest, wealthiest corporations on the planet engaged in offshore wind energy, for example. So here was an unnamed midstream gas company from Canada show up with $10 billion, and it sure got Coos Bay's attention, and they bought their way through this community. So now we're facing even deeper challenges that I think makes it really, really important for community leaders and planners to hear voices to say how a broader group of this community values these places.
So is there opportunity for public comment?
Yes, there is. The estuary management plan is, the revision process is you take stock of what is there. And for the last 6 or 8 years, there's been a group of people from the University of Oregon gathering information. Now we live in a time of geographic information systems. The original estuary management plan was magic markers on Mylar sheets, because that was the technology of the day. So the folks from U of O have converted the 1984 plan. It was written on a typewriter. It wasn't in a digital format, with no PDF files for this. So they've actually transcribed the entire 1984 management plan to a digital format that I showed you, that Coos County website. All those resources are now available. It's complicated. There's 2 volumes just for one estuary. There's a different one for the Coquille estuary. So yes, that's the phase, what they're calling phase 1. That is now, they're doing some fact checking, but they've done all the studies and brought them forward and added that. So they have this information resource now, and they've created some new maps like tsunami inundation maps that weren't part of the original. So that's sort of the template of the starting point for the conversation. And the county just now is rolling that out to the cities, particularly in Coos Bay, because it's one of these deep draft estuaries, it's more complicated. It's rolling that out to the cities to say, okay, we've actually changed that original document because it started out on paper. And there can be some transcription errors, and we've cleaned up some typos. So actually this electronic document we have now is actually different. Not substantively, hopefully, but that transcription process of shifting it to this modern technology has maybe left some things out or misinterpreted something that was there before, or corrected a mapping error. So they have to present that back to the cities and the county commission to say, are you guys okay with this now representing what our plan is? It's not a changed plan. Actually, City of Coos Bay made a few changes through the years. So they brought those changes forward and sort of meshed them together. So it's now what we think our plan is today. And so then the cities will say, okay, from here on out, we'll leave the paper aside. And when someone comes to the planning desk, we'll use this thing. It's still the 84 plan. The next step is to take that with all this new information resource and say, where do we want to go? Right now, there's no funding for that, to do that. And there's like 3 planning staff over in Coquille. And this is it's a big effort. I don't know. It had something to do with Hercules. But yes, and so that will be a public process, and we're working very hard to make sure that when there are opportunities for public input, that's widely known.
Is there a final end date that you're hoping to have some completion?
I would expect this process to take a few years,
Oh, okay.
and as well it should. All right, well, thank you again very much.
Mike, thank you for such an informative and eye-opening presentation. I mean, I certainly have been moved to be more proactive and involved. I hope that many of you feel, not all of you feel the same way. Very important environment that we must protect for a lot of different reasons. So thank you. And again, before y'all go, please sign in if you didn't. If you're interested in how to become a member of C or perhaps to volunteer, please see Lori, our volunteer manager right there. She's got her hand up. And we really appreciate your coming today. And Mike, we have a little something for you to show our appreciation.
Yeah, we really went all out in wrapping this.
Ray would be proud.
Just don't drink.
All right.
It's not cold.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day. Yeah.